Welcome to the 14th year and the 24th Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series event. I'm very pleased that we've chosen to change our format this time around to include 3 lecturers, Alyssa Adamson, Helen Scott, and Nancy Holmstrom, in a Saturday symposium co-sponsored by the English department. Each panelist will share a particular perspective on the life and work of Rosa Luxemburg and will connect Luxemburg's work to issues of relevance in the 21st century. Here's where I'm not very tech savvy. No. Oh, that was it. Back. All right. This lecture series was created in honor of Will Miller, my late husband, who passed away in March 2005. Will would have loved to be here for this talk, as he was a great admirer of Luxemburg's work, so much so that our dog, Rosa, was named for her. Really, the picture just needed to be of the dog, but I could only find one of the 3 of us. So much so that our dog Rosa was named for her, offering him the opportunity to talk about Luxemburg's work, especially if someone mistakenly assumed that she was named for Rosa Parks. In fact, we did have a sheep named Rosa Parks, but she came into our lives later on. Will would have also loved to hear 2 of his comrades speaking about Luxembourg. Nancy and Will knew each other many years ago when they met at Radical Philosophers Association meetings, and he frequently referred to her work and used her writings in his philosophy classes. Helen and Will worked together as colleagues, anti-war activists, and union organizers on the UVM campus. Regretfully, he never had the opportunity to meet Alyssa, but we do. Will was a social justice activist and University of Vermont philosophy professor for 35 years. As our logo states, he will always be remembered as a clear voice in a world of false words and disinformation. We could benefit from his energy, his intellect, his insights, and his imagination in these incredibly challenging times when disinformation is rampant and where anyone can say anything and it can be considered newsworthy, even if the information is known to be false. This lecture series was originally designed by Will, myself, and a few of our friends, including Helen, to bring speakers to the Burlington community and the UVM campus, to provide a radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. During Will's tenure as a faculty member at UVM, he worked with student, faculty, and local groups to help bring voices to our area that may otherwise have been silenced or not given a chance to be heard without his efforts. Will set a courageous example in speaking truth to power as a faculty member, as a union organizer, and as a socialist feminist political organizer, as an anti-war activist, and as a concerned person working for social justice locally and globally. Will showed a boundless optimism and a passion for the truth. His voice was powerful, especially in encouraging others, students, staff, faculty, community members, and people from around the world to speak up and be heard. He showed a personal strength and an unwavering commitment to the struggle against war and for social justice, and he helped move others into action. He was never afraid to speak his mind, put words into action, or place himself on the line, whether it be before university trustees, on a picket line, at a barricade, or in each of the congressional offices. Will offered reasoned and insightful analyses into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us a call to struggle and a vision of a more just society. He advocated for a society where all work is valued, where truth is not silenced but is nurtured, a society where all are treated as equals, that is at peace with itself, and where people and resources are not exploited. UVM should not only be a place where students and faculty learn about struggles for social justice, but it should also be a place where students, faculty, and staff continue to struggle against oppression, speak out against injustice, and speak up for justice. Will worked tirelessly for a faculty union and a staff union at UVM, and he would be proud of the work that United Academics is doing on campus. On our website, you can learn more about Will, the work he was involved in, and see his webpage, which one might describe as packed and primitive, as he started it in the days when one had to know how to write HTML code. A link to his webpage can be found on our webpage, willmiller.org. We bring you these lectures with the generous support from members of our community, including many of you. Thank you to those of you who have already sent in donations. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to do so, donations can be made today at our table at the doorway, or you can pick up an addressed donation envelope to mail to us later on. Also, if you have received our recent emails, you may have noticed that there is now a donation button for you to give directly online. No donation is too small. It should be noted that this lecture series is not affiliated with UVM, so that's why donations are essential. However, this lecture has been generously co-sponsored by the English department. We send out information about our lectures through snail mail, email, social media, so please sign our clipboards, which will be passed around. And if you're a student, it's helpful if you give us your non-UVM address, where they just bounce back and I spend time deleting. We also encourage you to friend the lecture series on Facebook to continue to hear about our work. I would especially like to thank a few groups who co-sponsor all of our events: United Academics, Black Rose, Rosa Negra, Burlington, Global Justice Ecology Project, and Will Miller Green Mountain Veterans for Peace. We thank and appreciate CCTV, which records all of our events and rebroadcasts them on Channel 17 and through their website, so that our lectures continue to be available. Thank you to the Lecture Series Board, Fred Magdoff, Helen Scott, Michael Cassidy, Ron Jacobs, Isaac Kreisman, and my new partner, Paul Fassler. This event could not have happened without your efforts. And thank you to Patrick St. John for yet another great poster. Nancy Welch, who is also a professor in the English department here at UVM, will moderate the discussion after the three panelists conclude their presentations and will now introduce the lecturers to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our panelists, I also want to acknowledge something happening on the UVM campus. As many of you know, there's a group of students of color and queer students who have been sanctioned for failing to comply with the university official who wanted them to turn off their megaphone and end a 1-hour rally that they were holding in Waterman against racism and sexism on campus. And so I think that in the spirit of Will Miller, in a moment I'd like to count to 3, and I would like for us all to say together, we are all non-compliant, okay? So 1, 2, 3, we are all non-compliant. Thank you. Okay, so 2019 marks the centenary of the murder of visionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg, but her legacy is very much alive in the political struggles of our own age. 3 activist scholars come together this afternoon to address key elements of this inspiring revolutionary's life and work. Our first speaker will be Helen Scott. She provides a contextual overview. Dr. Scott is Associate Professor at the University of Vermont of English and has published broadly in post-colonial literature and theory. She is the editor of The Essential Rosa Luxemburg, co-editor with Paul LeBlanc of an anthology of Luxemburg's writings, Socialism or Barbarism, and the author most recently of an article in the collection, Rosa Luxemburg and Postcoloniality. She presented on Luxemburg's cultural analysis at the International Rosa Luxemburg Conference in Chicago and at the Political Philosophy of Rosa Luxemburg, a Critical Assessment Conference in Berlin. Next, Nancy Holmstrom explores Luxemburg's significance for feminism. Dr. Holmstrom is Professor Emerita at Rutgers University. She has published broadly in the area of political, especially Marxist philosophy. She is editor of the Socialist Feminist Project and co-author of Capitalism for and Against, a Feminist Debate, and her article, Rosa Luxemburg, A Legacy for Feminists, ? Appears in the collection Rosa Remix. Finally, Alyssa Adamson takes up Luxembourg's commitment to anti-imperialism. Dr. Adamson earned her PhD from Stony Brook University last year with a dissertation in political philosophy that provides a rereading of Hegel, Marx, and post-colonial theory from the perspective of queer theory. She now teaches at Western Connecticut State University and SUNY Purchase, and she recently presented at the International Rosa Luxemburg Conference in Chicago on Luxembourg and decolonial theory. After our three panelists present, we will open things up for a whole room discussion. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. So Rosa Luxemburg's legacy is very live, very relevant, and very contested. And one of the ways to understand the particular political valence that she continues to have is to see her not only as an exceptional individual, which she surely was, but also as a figure who crystallized the social forces of her historical moment. And the far too short, not quite half a century of her life, spanned an era in Europe that saw the rapid development of industrial capitalism with all its attendant horrors: imperialism and war, appalling conditions for workers, rapid and unsettling social transformations, devastating displacements of people, widespread poverty and hardship. But it also witnessed the unprecedented rise of mass socialist organization among the new working class. This global movement came closer to overthrowing the entire system and replacing it with socialism than any other force in any time in human history. Luxembourg thus lived in a terrible time, but also one of great hope and possibility. And it's this sense of immense potential that Luxembourg represents. She embodies the best of the mass collective force for social change, and in so doing, continues to represent a threat to the establishment, even as she speaks to the individuals and movements engaged in a struggle for a more just world. Although her life was cut short, her achievements were many, and I can't possibly do justice to them in 20 minutes. What I will do is try to provide an overview and to flag some of the key moments and political contributions, and our other two speakers will expand upon more of the details. So Luxembourg's early life in Poland under the occupation of Russian Tsarism was shaped by the combined worst of old feudalism and new capitalism. She faced the oppression faced by all Polish people whose language and culture were restricted. Additionally, the Jewish community, of which she was a member, was further persecuted and denied basic civil rights. She suffered from a lifelong disability due to a mistreated hip condition from her childhood, and she was a woman at a time when the public political realm was overwhelmingly dominated by men. Poisonous, misogynist attacks were directed against her from the establishment and also, sadly, from some in the movement itself. She was alert to class inequality and had no tolerance for oppression or discrimination of any kind. She was also opposed to all kinds of sectionalism or cultural nationalism, the idea that only those suffering a particular oppression can understand or challenge it, because she saw inequality and chauvinism as integral to capitalism and therefore damaging all sections of the working class. She advocated a politics of solidarity. Even while at school, she joined the illegal socialist movement. She was a superb student, but was denied the gold medal, which was her due, because of her, quote, rebellious attitude towards authorities. When her activities became known to the authorities, she had to escape Poland, and she was actually to remain outside her country of birth for most of her life. She went first to Switzerland and the University of Zurich, which was known as the alma mater of young radicals. She went on to earn her PhD in economics, unheard of for a woman at that time. And then in the alternative school of socialist politics, she helped organize in exile a Polish revolutionary group which resembled and at many times worked closely with the Russian Bolsheviks. But Luxembourg went next to Germany in order to join the Party of Social Democracy, the SPD. So in her life, she was actually the leader of socialist movements in 3 countries, Germany, Poland, and Russia, as well as the Socialist International, which was the worldwide federation of socialist groups. Now, the SPD was the largest party in the International, and it was rapidly transforming at the turn of the century. Brutally suppressed under the regime of Bismarck, and subject to the anti-socialist laws that were in place between 1877 and 1890, in 1891, the newly legal party established what it called the twin goals of the so-called Erfurt program, which was named for the town where it was drawn up. And these were the maximum program, socialist revolution, and the minimum program, which meant reforms in the here and now. In the context of a politically conscious working class, the SPD grew dramatically in the coming decades, both in sheer numbers and in influence on the formal political establishment. In 1881, these numbers give you a sense of the rapidity of the change. In 1881, the party won 6% of the votes in the Reichstag, which was the German equivalent of the House of Representatives. In 1903, it held more than 30%. By 1912, it was the largest party, and by 1914, it had more than 1 million members. So these were impressive achievements, but the institutional growth also had a paradoxically conservatizing impact. As the party grew, so did its investment in the system and in its financial coffers. And sections of the leadership became more focused on getting votes and burnishing their official reputation than on struggles for liberation. A permanent bureaucracy developed who were well paid, largely separated from the members, and accustomed to being part of the establishment. So these were the conditions that led to a distinct tendency known as revisionism, reformism, or opportunism, depending on who you talk to. An eminent member called Edward Bernstein had become a spokesperson for this wing. He, rather prematurely, at the turn of the 20th century, argued that capitalism had resolved its crises, wars were a thing of the past, and a revolution was no longer necessary because all social problems could be solved through gradual reforms and change from within the system. Rosa Luxemburg shows up in 1898, a total outsider, a woman, a Pole, a Jew, physically small, walking with a limp, and became the most outspoken revolutionary opponent of revisionism. She responded to Bernstein in a stunning series of articles that were published as Reform or Revolution. This work remains essential reading for contemporary political debates about the reformability of capitalism. One of my favorite quotes gives a flavor of her wonderfully figurative rhetorical voice. She compared the reformists to earlier so-called utopian socialists, such as François Fourier, who advocated socialism through cooperatives that were known as phalansteries. She said this: Fourier's scheme of changing, by means of a system of phalansteries, the water of all the seas into tasty lemonade, was surely a fantastic idea. But Bernstein, proposing to change the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by progressively pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade, presents an idea that is nearly more insipid, but no less fantastic. You really just didn't want to be on the wrong side of this woman. She argued that, far from choosing a different path to socialism, the reformists had actually jettisoned the goal of social transformation altogether in favor of making peace with the system. Reform or revolution argues that capitalism is built on exploitation and oppression. They aren't optional, but integral to the system. Class domination is embedded in the economy. It isn't something that is legislated, and therefore it can't be abolished through laws. And the political and legal systems are not neutral, but rigged in favor of the propertied classes. Socialism is about the establishment of a new society, one that no longer rests on capitalist accumulation and wage labor, and revolution is the only way to secure a world without class domination and oppression. Luxemburg did not, however, downplay the importance of immediate political struggles. She argued that socialists should make use of all available rights in order to win reforms that are crucial and valuable in themselves, because they may help alleviate suffering and will defend against further attacks. But she held that these struggles are just as important as means to the end of overthrowing capitalism. She thus had a very dialectical understanding of the interplay between the processes. I'm going to quote her again, and for this and following quotes, by the way, proletariat just is a synonym for the working class, the oppressed majority, but it was widely used during this time. It's kind of not used anymore. She writes, democracy is indispensable to the working class because only through the exercise of its democratic rights in the struggle for democracy can the proletariat become aware of its class interests and its historic task. In a word, democracy is indispensable not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. In other words, the movement should employ, defend, and extend whatever rights and freedoms are available without being under the illusion that they will tame capitalism or on their own lead to socialism. Now, Luxemburg won the debates with Bernstein, but the forces of reformism nonetheless continued to grow in the party. And the next major battle that this produced came in 1905, when revolution broke out in Russia, in what came to be known as the Great Dress Rehearsal for 1917. Luxemburg traveled to Russia at great personal danger in order to play a leading role. In fairly short order, the revolution was crushed, and Luxemburg, along with Lenin and countless others, spent a period in prison. But the momentous events of 1905 gave a sense of how much could be achieved from the mass concerted efforts of workers. When she was able to return to Germany, Luxemburg went on a speaking tour which brought the lessons to the public, and she distilled these in her book, The Mass Strike. Now, this work was also an intervention in debates about the trade union movement, and it too speaks to contemporary political debates. The German trade unions had been going through the same tremendous growth as the party, as for the SPD, this brought both many successes but also conservatism. Some among the permanent bureaucracy now espoused safe, bread and butter economist unionism, arguing that unions should steer away from controversial political issues and distance themselves from socialism. Like the SPD reformists, they feared radical action that could escape their control, rock the boat, or offend the establishment. They too saw the building of the unions as an end in its own right, rather than a means to defend workers' rights in the present while helping the struggle for a new society in the long term. Luxemburg saw in the Russian Revolution of 1905 a counter-model. First, she observed that revolutionary struggle flows between the economic and the political fluidly, Political demands turn to wage demands and vice versa in quick succession. Second, mass strikes achieve more in days than can be accomplished in years or decades of carefully planned union and parliamentary organizing. And finally, even when the particular strike or movement is defeated, and even if some of the gains are rescinded, the struggle itself does something that can't be taken away. She writes, "The most precious, because lasting, thing in this rapid ebb and flow of the wave is its mental sediment, the intellectual, cultural growth of the proletariat, which proceeds by fits and starts, and which offers an inviolable guarantee of their further irresistible progress in the economic as in the political struggle." Now, all of this really speaks to the mass strike wave that is sweeping the US today, the Red for Ed teachers' strikes. All of Luxemburg's lessons can be seen here: the movement between political and economic demands, the rapid achievement of victories that have seemed unthinkable for decades, and the political education that happens in the process of struggle that is lasting and that feeds into future movements. Luxemburg went on to make many more lasting contributions, some of which will be taken up by Alyssa and Nancy. In what's left of my time, I want to sketch some of the key events in the rest of her life and draw some generalizations. First, Luxembourg was always an internationalist. She opposed nations and borders and argued that workers share bonds of interests and solidarity far greater than anything they have in common with their respective ruling classes. Stemming from this was her rejection of all forms of nationalism, chauvinism, racism, and discrimination. She saw how imperialism and militarism are integral to capitalism and campaigned against all forms of imperialism and war. At the outbreak of World War I, most of the leaders of the Second International betrayed the principle of international solidarity on which they were founded and lined up with the war efforts of their own ruling classes. When the leadership of the SPD, including Luxembourg's one-time close comrade Karl Kautsky, voted to support the war, Luxembourg condemned their actions with searing irony, referencing Marx's famous slogan, quote, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." She writes, "For the proletariat, there is not one vital rule as scientific socialism has hitherto proclaimed, but rather there are two such rules, one for peace and one for war. In peacetime, the class struggle applies within each country and international solidarity vis-à-vis other countries. In wartime, it is class solidarity within and the struggle between the workers of the various countries without. The global historical appeal of the Communist Manifesto undergoes a fundamental revision and, as amended by Kautsky, now reads, proletarians of all countries, unite in peacetime and cut each other's throats in war." Despite this crushing betrayal, however, Luxembourg did not collapse, but rather joined with other revolutionaries to build a new movement which carried forward the principles of internationalism and anti-imperialism with the slogans, "End the war by strikes" and "The main enemy is at home." Luxembourg spent most of the war in prison, and her writings from a series of increasingly bleak cells are moving testimony to the human spirit under extreme duress. They show that her revolutionary drive came from great compassion, powers of empathy, and respect for humanity and all life, including animals and the natural world. I'm sure Luxembourg put up with a lot more. But she didn't have cell phones to deal with. Luxembourg always maintained a vision of an alternative and saw the potential in life, even at the bleakest of times. Her Junius pamphlet, written in prison, remains one of the most powerful anti-war statements of all time. It is almost impossible reading it today not to see today's crises in Syria or Yemen in her description of a world at war. She writes, "Business is flourishing upon the ruins. Cities are turned into shambles, whole countries into deserts, villages into cemeteries, whole nations into beggars, churches into stables. Popular rights, treaties, alliances, the holiest words and the highest authorities have been torn into scraps. Shamed, dishonored, wading in blood and dripping with filth. Thus capitalist society stands. Not as we usually see it, playing the roles of peace and righteousness, of order, of philosophy, of ethics, but as a roaring beast, as an orgy of anarchy, as a pestilential breath, devastating culture and humanity. So it appears in all its hideous nakedness." When she was released from prison, she threw herself into the German Revolution, a tremendous mass movement that ended the war and, with the revolutions underway in Russia and globally, held out the prospect of deep social transformation. She helped to found the German Communist Party and continued to agitate and organize. Meanwhile, the reformist wing of the SPD had come to power, state power, and as Luxemburg predicted in her critique of reformism, the leaders now played a counter-revolutionary role, defending the establishment against the working class movement. In January 1919, the revolution was dealt a massive blow with the massacre of workers in Berlin on the orders of the Social Democratic government. The vicious Noski Guard, the core of what would become fascism, arrested Luxemburg and her close ally Karl Liebknecht. They were interrogated, beaten, and murdered. Luxemburg's body was weighed and thrown into the canal and wasn't to be found for several months. And when you come to this part of Luxemburg's biography, it is hard not to be overwhelmed with heartbreak and despair. But even within this devastating moment, Luxemburg provided future hope. Her final essay, Order Reigns in Berlin, draws out the lessons of January with stunning clarity and points a way forward. She writes, "The leadership failed, but the leadership can and must be created anew by the masses and out of the masses. The masses are the crucial factor. They are the rock on which the ultimate victory of the revolution will be built. The masses were up to the task. They fashioned this defeat into a part of those historical defeats which constitute the pride and power of international socialism. And that is why this defeat is the seed of the future triumph." As this indicates, she was to the end a brave revolutionary fighter who stood up to tyranny, and first and foremost, she was an activist, always rooted in working class struggle, for which she gained the respect of the rank and file of the socialist and labor movements. Unlike the right wing of the SPD, who ended up running the system their party was founded to challenge, Luxemburg never became isolated from the ordinary working class men and women in the broader movement. Instead, she drew from it and gave it permanent expression in her written work. Finally, Luxemburg characterized the alternatives facing humanity as that between socialism or barbarism. A century later, we see the barbarism of capitalism on a daily basis, in the criminalization and incarceration of men, women, and children seeking refuge from war and poverty, in the continued dispossession of colonized people, in the relentless attack on working class lives and working conditions in rich and poor countries alike, in the pervasive sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression that impact all areas of life, and in the ecological devastation now facing our planet. But so do we see heroic struggles and resistance from workers and oppressed globally. Palestinians standing up against the Israeli state, opposition to the resurgence of fascism, the Me Too movement breaking the silence around sexual abuse, teachers in Red for Ed fighting for their students' lives. In the US, we are currently undergoing a renewed interest in socialism, which offers the potential to build these isolated struggles and connect them to a broader movement. The legacy of Rosa Luxemburg, with its record of victories, losses, mistakes, and profound insights, has an important part to play in this daunting but still essential project. Thank you.
Hi. Raise your hand if you don't hear me well, if there are any problems, okay? Rosa Luxemburg is a great hero of mine, so I thank you all for the opportunity to participate in this event. I'm also very happy to be speaking in a lecture series dedicated to Will Miller's history of activism and scholarship. I liked him and respected him a great deal. I particularly remember an article that he wrote in Monthly Review on human nature and why it's not a barrier to socialism, as many would claim. And I remember meeting Anne and Rosa, one of their animals. It was quite memorable. Forgive me for just a little bit of overlap with what you said at the beginning. Not surprising, I guess, that we'd go on for the same things. Anyway, many people who know something about Rosa Luxemburg would be surprised to hear the title of this talk, which is Rosa Luxemburg's Legacy for Feminism. They know Luxemburg as the author of the brilliant pamphlets, The Mass Strike, the Reform and Revolution. They know that she debated with famous leaders of the Social Democrats and even with Lenin. Maybe they know her theoretical work or something about it, The Accumulation of Capital, in which she put forward the powerful claim that capitalist accumulation both depends on non-capitalist relations. So what Marx called primitive accumulation was an ongoing process, but at the same time needs to consume those non-capitalist relations and destroy them. This point, incidentally, has been picked up and elaborated and, I wouldn't say popularized, but made more famous by David Harvey under the name Accumulation by Dispossession. But what did Luxemburg write about women? How can she have a legacy for feminism? At a conference sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation some years ago, there was a panel that I was on with a similar title to this talk, and one speaker said she didn't think that Rosa was, Luxemburg or Rosa, which should I say, was even a feminist. Certainly, Rosa Luxemburg is a model for feminists of all times in her passionate commitment to both to understanding the nature of our oppressive system and, most importantly, to changing it. Certainly, her life was an inspiration for feminists in that she pursued both her political and her personal life without concern for what women were and were not supposed to do. And personally, she rejected bourgeois standards of sexual morality and had passionate love affairs. Her letters, by the way, are a great source of information about her personality, her personal life, and also theoretical debates. But what exactly did she contribute theoretically and politically to an understanding of women's position in capitalism? To the question, in other words, of how are sexism and capitalism related and how can we combat them? Some might think she was not a feminist because they equate her views on sexism and capitalism with her views on national liberation. Though she was a Polish and a Jew living in Germany, she was quite uninterested in struggles for national liberation for Poland. She thought genuine national liberation was impossible under capitalism, and hence her focus was on building a working class movement to overcome capitalism. National liberation would take care of itself after the revolution. And as you probably are aware, some Marxists take this position about sexism after the revolution. But I don't think this is Luxemburg's position. If not, then what would she have to say about theoretical debates among socialist feminists today? Was she a feminist in this sense? And on the practical political questions facing feminists today, does her work give us any guidance? These are the questions that I'll try to address in this talk. As I said, Luxemburg wrote next to nothing regarding women and was not active in the women's movement. But it doesn't follow that she wasn't a feminist or that she was uninterested in women's issues. Think of all the things that we care about but don't make central to our work. Why should women's issues have to be her primary area of interest? We can have a division of labor. I believe Luxemburg does have a legacy for feminism, and we needn't focus, to find out what it is, we needn't focus only on her writings directly related to women and gender. Oftentimes, feminism is equated with one's position just on issues of feminism and gender, women and gender. So I said something in a paper a while back about Hillary Clinton being bad for women, and someone said, but she's for abortion rights, and she's, et cetera. And I said, well, wait, there's a lot more than that to judge her whether she's good for women or not. Luxemburg's absolute commitment to socialism from below, expressed in her debates both with social democratic leaders and with Lenin. In her pamphlets, where she emphasized the development, the experience and development of capacities of working class people in all their struggles. And I have the same quote, but I won't repeat it, about the most important thing about struggles is the development of those capacities and understanding, is the mental sentiment, sediment, etc. These are the positions that drew me to Luxembourg in the first place. And there's no political area of work to which these are not fundamental. So this is a crucial part of her legacy for feminism and everything else. But turning to women and gender issues, it was Clara Zetkin, Luxembourg's close comrade and close friend, who was well known for her work with working class women, including forming groups of women very similar to the 1970s consciousness-raising groups, which made Lenin very uneasy. He said, you hear Clara's organizing these groups, etc. August Bebel, who wrote Women and Socialism and other works on women, thoroughly believed in women's equality and was supportive of Luxembourg. He and other male leaders of the SPD urged Luxembourg to get more involved with the question of a women's emancipation. And who knows what she would have done if she was so brilliant if she had. But she resisted. She and Clara both saw this as an attempt to get Luxembourgs off their backs, since she was to their left. Though the two friends, Rosa and Clara, worked in different areas, they were closely aligned in SPD politics, and I know of no evidence that Luxembourg disagreed with Zetkin's work with women. On the contrary, in some of her last letters of November 1918, she asked Zetkin for an article on women for their Spartacist newspaper, saying, the issue is so important now, and none of us here understand anything about it, unquote. And then she asked Zetkin to edit a women's section of the Spartacist paper, saying, it's such an urgent matter, every day lost is a sin, unquote. Based on this correspondence and on her short writings on women's issues, it should be abundantly clear to everyone that Luxembourg was a Marxist or socialist feminist, as we use the terms today. And in the book that Nancy mentioned that I edited the Socialist Feminist Project. I wanted to show that socialist feminism was not an artifact of the 70s, was an ongoing project. I didn't include any of the 70s writings since they were available. And I included a section on foremothers and fathers, and I included, wrote something that Luxemburg had written. So I'll say very briefly how I characterize a socialist feminist, some of whom, by my definition, are Marxists, and some are not. And then try to say where Luxemburg would stand on the debates among us. All socialist feminists see class as central to women's lives, yet at the same time, none would reduce sex or race oppression to economic exploitation. And all of us see those aspects of our lives as inseparably and systematically related. In other words, class is gendered and raced, and vice versa. The term intersectionality has come to be used for this position. Luxemburg certainly held to this perspective, as she recognized some kinds of oppression as common to all women, and others varying by class and by nation. It was the special needs of working women that were Luxemburg's priority, but she also supported positions that some Marxists might see as merely bourgeois demands, including the end of all laws that discriminated against women and women's suffrage. In this, she agreed with August Bebel, who said, quote, "Working class women have more in common with bourgeois women or aristocratic women than do working class men with men of other classes," because there was specific gender kind of oppression. Luxemburg advocated these universal legal rights both as a matter of principle and for pragmatic political reasons. Bringing women into politics would help combat what she called the suffocating air of the Philistine family that she said affected even socialist men, which is something that is maybe provocative even today, but true. Legal equality, in her view, was a necessary condition for women's emancipation, but true emancipation for women would take the end of capitalism and women's economic independence from men. Quote, "In the view of many vulgar men and bourgeois civil law, whoever owns bread rules the house. The history of the family pattern is indeed the history of women's enslavement," unquote. Thus, women need equal pay, equal work, and social supports for family. Luxemburg also supported suffrage on the pragmatic political grounds that it would build the ranks of the social democratic forces. These positions were actually in advance of the bourgeois women's organizations of the time. On one occasion, she critiqued social democrats willing to compromise on women's suffrage in order to make an electoral alliance with the liberals. So the most radical of socialists are oftentimes the best feminists. Coming back to the theoretical debates among feminists today, within the broad definition of intersectionality, there are differences regarding how we should understand these kinds of oppression and how they're related. Some socialist feminists see capitalism and sexism, usually called patriarchy, as two distinct, though intersecting, systems with equal explanatory importance. And other systems to account for race and ethnic oppression are often added to the picture. But I'm going to ignore that here. Just as capitalism is constituted by relations of oppression and exploitation between capitalists and workers, patriarchy is a system in which men oppress women. Some also say men exploit women, which they explain in different ways. And that position is known as a dual systems position. On the other hand, other Marxist or socialist feminists believe there's only one kind of oppression and exploitation today in the current period that really constitutes a system with full explanatory powers, and that's capitalism. However, other distinct, non-reducible kinds of oppression, like sexism and racism, play more or less important roles within the framework of that system of capitalism at different times and places. One system or two is a highly abstract theoretical question. And sometimes, strangely, it doesn't make a difference practically to your political practice. But sometimes it is connected to the practical political one of what kind of political organizing should take place. Should it always be class issues, labor struggles, and other economic issues, which aren't differentiated or not especially along gender lines? Or is it legitimate from a socialist point of view to give equal importance to distinctly women's issues? Dual systems theorists, of course, have no problem saying either one. Both are equally important. Organizing around class or sex or race issues. Why not? On the other hand, what political implications can be drawn from the one system of theoretical approach, which is my position? In my opinion, and I want to stress this, it does not follow from the one system analysis that struggles around sex or race oppression should never necessarily take a lower political priority. Socialist feminists try to integrate the two, whatever their views on the abstract question of one or two systems. For example, socialist feminists support the right to the legal right to abortion, as do liberal feminists, but they combine that with the right access to birth control, medical care, child care, better and equal pay, certainly more than $15 an hour, all the things necessary to give working class women a genuine choice over their reproduction. They use the term reproductive rights, reproductive freedom, and black feminists particularly prefer the phrase reproductive justice. Luxembourg, I'm pretty sure, assumed the one system position, giving theoretical primacy to capitalism as a framework in which other kinds of oppressions operate. On the practical political question, I can't say for sure, but I'd like to think she would have the flexible position regarding political priorities that I've described. Perhaps that's because it's my view. In her short work, Women's Suffrage and Class Struggle, which she wrote in 1912, which I've included in the Foremothers section of my socialist feminist book, Luxemburg makes an important theoretical argument that's relevant to current debates. She writes the following, quote, "Only that work is productive which produces surplus value and yields capitalist profit, as long as the rule of capital and the wage system still exists. From this standpoint, the dancer in a cafe who makes a profit for her employer with her legs is a productive working woman, while all the toil of the women and mothers of the proletariat within the four walls of the home is considered unproductive work. This sounds crude and crazy, but it's an accurate expression of the crudeness and craziness of today's capitalist economic order," unquote. Now, I've used that quote more than once to clarify the meaning of productive and unproductive in capitalism, and also to distinguish the concept of oppression from capitalist exploitation. Some feminists, I have found, are very offended by the Marxist position, by Marxist concentration on wage labor in the first place, and by the Marxist position that housework is unproductive labor, as Luxemburg was explaining. And some feminists argue for wages for housework. But as the quote from Luxemburg makes clear, designating housework as unproductive is hardly an insult, nor is it sexist. A male carpenter who works for the government is equally unproductive in capitalist terms, though both, obviously, and very importantly, are productive in a general sense. It's crucial to understand what the word productive means in capitalist terms, namely production of surplus value, because it's this that makes the capitalist system tick. There's more to be said about what's called the domestic labor debate, which is how to understand non-waged work in capitalism. However, an important point is that even in 1912, Luxemburg pointed out, quote, millions of proletarian women produce capitalist profit just like men in factories, workshops, agriculture, housework industries, offices, and stores. They're productive, therefore, in the strictest economic sense of society today. So there's no reason, no need to equate women's work with non-waged work in the home, as is so often done. Luxemburg used that fact as an argument for suffrage. It showed that patriarchal conceptions of women's proper role had simply become obsolete, even in 1912. And now, you know, I think the majority, but I could be wrong about this, of women in newly developing capitalist countries, the majority of workers are female. I agree with Luxemburg on this theoretical point about the productive, non-productive business of housework and its importance. However, I think we have to be careful not to overstate its political importance. I think some feminists take that position because they think that if it were productive, that would entail that how there should be equal political emphasis organizing housework. But even if housework were productive of surplus value, it wouldn't follow that organizing housewives should be a priority for socialists. Compare guards in private prisons who produce surplus value. Though exploited by capital, they certainly would not be promising candidates for socialist organizing. On the other hand, while public sector workers are not productive in this sense, they're a key sector for labor organizing today and should be, given the attacks on the public sector. Where socialists should put their best energies depends on many factors, and we need to be alert to changing conditions. Though it's not a valid criticism of Marx, the stress by feminists on the importance of non-waged work done largely by women is undeniable. Indeed, it's been called the labor that makes all other labor possible. Marxist socialist feminists, particularly those espousing what has come to be called social reproduction feminists, have attempted to develop a complete story of labor in capitalism, some waged, some not. Their conception is of a single system of species reproduction, always involving a division of labor, but one that takes different forms related to different changes in the capitalist economy. Neither the relations of production nor of reproduction are given by nature, but are the result of gender and class struggles. Feminists in the United States have made demands to support caregiving as a public good, as indeed it is, and as it is in many countries with stronger social democratic traditions. Even there, however, neoliberalism, a response to the ongoing crisis of capitalism, has led to cutbacks in every field of social reproduction. Thus, socialist feminists should make clear that these crucial demands should be recognized as transitional demands in the sense that they are not all winnable securely under capitalism, but rather point us towards a different society. A society that gave equal value to non-waged caring labor would be socialism, not capitalism. In a socialist mode of production dedicated to the satisfaction of need, not profit, the constraints of this crude and crazy economic system of capitalism would not apply. On the contrary, because what drives the two systems is different, what counts as productive and unproductive would be different. Instead of productive being defined in terms of what's productive of profit, it would be defined in terms of what's productive of well-being. Hence, all the non-wage caring labor that's done for free, out of love, that's necessary in all societies would be recognized as the essential productive labor that it is. And consider the scientific and creative work that's not done because it's not profitable, but would enhance our lives in manifold ways. Unproductive in capitalist terms, but productive in socialism. On the other hand, much of the labor that is productive in capitalism would be rightly recognized as unproductive. Weapons, plastic, throwaway junk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A good percentage of what is produced, actually, right? Luxemburg's stress on the meaning of productive labor in this crazy capitalist system also helps to explain why capitalism is leading to the destruction of our planet and why we need to build a society based on production for human needs. On the eve of World War I, Luxemburg famously said the choice is clear, socialism or barbarism. Today, this has a whole new existential meaning. It's eco-socialism or death. For capitalism is, for better and for worse, an economic growth machine. The world economy now produces in less than 2 weeks the equivalent of the entire physical output of the year 1900. And global economic output now doubles every 25 to 30 years. China's transition to a global capitalist/communist, whatever, economic power and its lack of democratic controls threaten ecological apocalypse. The basic problem lies in the conflict between the individualist rationality enforced by a competitive market system and what's rational from a social point of view. Each firm is compelled to act to maximize its own individual interests, and it goes on, though the results are catastrophic. One would think that self-destruction would be a refutation of this individualist model of rational economic behavior, but it's too deeply rooted in capitalist ideology for mainstream economists to give it up. Organizing around this issue has to be central to everyone today. My last point, with regard to political organization, what can Luxemburg tell us? Certainly she had a lifelong commitment to socialist organization, much as she stressed spontaneity from below as crucial. However, she also argued for a working women's organization independent of the bourgeois women's movement, so they could better fight for their specific needs, at the same time supporting universal women's interests. That's an intersectional approach. More controversially, on the left, she also supported women's independent self-organization within the working class, and even among socialists, encouraging Zetkin to found a women's section of the Spartacist League. This position, I would point out, is ahead of many on the left today. So in conclusion, I think there is a great deal that Luxemburg's life and work can offer to contemporary socialist feminists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for that great paper. Thank you, Helen. All right, hopefully everyone's still alive after 2 long papers. I'm sorry that I have another paper and not an exciting presentation, but all right. So, as was said, I'll be talking about Luxembourg and the necessity of anti-imperialism. So today we have prominent political leaders calling themselves socialists and a growing national organization called the Democratic Socialists of America. But even if the terms socialist and democratic socialism are being used, it is often unclear what exactly is meant by these terms and to what sorts of concrete political measures do they correspond. Studying Luxembourg will help us to clarify the origins and meanings of these terms and better position us to understand what they should mean for us in 2019. If politicians are going to call themselves socialists, then we need to have a concrete grasp of what that means so that we can hold them accountable to their words. In this paper, I will outline what internationalism and anti-imperialism have to do with socialism according to Luxembourg, and how her critique of bourgeois political economy can deepen our understanding of socialism. I will conclude alongside Luxembourg that any socialism eliding questions of imperialism is not revolutionary and actually opens the door for reactionary and fascistic forces to gain power. Now, one side note, some things were mentioned about her position on national liberation, and while my paper is not on this, I think we could actually go deeper about some of the problematic aspects of her position against national liberation universally, which of course was a dialogue she had with Lenin, who made a distinction between progressive versus reactionary national liberation. And then one more note on race and anti-Semitism. The SPD, which she got the job in, her job was to organize what had been taken by the Germans from Poland in the tripartite division, and the SPD was pro-Germanization of Poles, so they wanted German schools, they wanted to eliminate the language, and she did sign on to this project for whatever reason, even though she was a Russian-Polish woman. So there is some complexity with her positions on that. We could say why, and that she literally told Polish people the SPD is the only party for your interests. But that's just a side note. Okay, I think Luxembourg is awesome and we need to understand what she's saying. All right, so for Luxembourg, and we should add for Marx and Engels, revolutionary socialism, by its very nature, must be connected to an internationalist struggle against capitalism and imperialism. What made possible the development of industrialization and modern capitalist nation states was the expropriation of wealth, land, resources, and labor that began with 15th century colonization onwards. Moreover, it is these ongoing practices of dispossession and imperialism that to this day allow our so-called national economies to run. Because imperialism and capitalism are organically related, one cannot be a legitimate socialist in the eyes of Luxembourg if one supports imperialist ventures, including supporting militarism and war to further nationalist capital accumulation. Luxembourg was uniquely attuned to these issues both because she had an outsider perspective on the German Empire as a Jewish Polish woman, and also because she watched the SPD, the Democratic Socialist Party of Germany, deviate from its initial anti-imperialist stances and finally vote for war credits to support World War I. The rightward swing of the SPD can be tracked in part with its assimilation in the German state. Anti-socialist laws in Germany pushed socialist organizing underground from 1878 to 1890. August Bebel, who was staunchly against German imperialism, would work to bring together social democratic forces and eventually found the SPD not underground in 1890 when anti-socialist laws were repealed. But now that socialists were able to engage publicly in German electoral politics, what this involvement meant and what it would look like was a new and serious question. In the end, the electoral strategy of the SPD would force it to reverse its position on German imperialism and militarism in order to not open itself to more state repression or to alienate itself from the German working class voter who would support a war. We can't forget that the military is largely seen as a job provider. In the US today, the military is our largest employer. While Luxembourg was a member of the SPD, she frequently disagreed with party leaders' conceptions of socialism and their tactics to build it in Germany. If imperialism has and continues to play a role in capital accumulation and assuaging the crises of capitalism, it must be kept front and center within socialist politics. Germany at the turn of the 20th century was becoming a colonial power, even if it was late to the game compared to other European countries. There was a specific crisis in Morocco that spurred Luxembourg to question the party's position on imperialism. The so-called 1911 Agadir crisis in Morocco occurred when French troops occupied Morocco, and Germany then sent the SMS Panther to protect their trade interests, which then triggered Britain to back France as they worried about German encroachment. Ultimately, the event was a scramble over colonial and imperial control of Morocco, and Germany was pressed by their own financial crisis to make sure they were not going to lose out. Eventually, France and Germany negotiate a redistribution of their colonies, with France taking all of Morocco. Luxembourg wanted to have a conference with the International Socialist Bureau to assess the specific situation, but the SPD refused to hold such a conference. Luxembourg wrote a scathing report of their reactionary attitudes in her pamphlet concerning Morocco. There, she named the SPD's hypocrisy. While it was willing to support anti-colonial Moroccan uprisings and even support protests in other countries around that issue, they were too worried about the coming elections to make any public statement about German militarism. In particular, she criticized SPD support of the Sultan of Morocco, who was just a puppet of imperialist demands. Quote, Bernstein only noticed in the act to condemn French invasion of Morocco the equal right of all trading nations in Morocco. And he quite strangely overlooked the fact that besides European traders, there's still another factor, which also has, as it were, certain rights, the native people, the tribes of Morocco, who are now rebelling, unquote. The party executive in Berlin wrote in response to Luxembourg, quote, if we were to commit ourselves firmly too soon and to stress the Moroccan question at the expense of all questions of domestic policy in such a way that an effective electoral slogan could be used against us, the consequences cannot be anticipated. Luxembourg responds, sorry, this is a long exchange. So Luxembourg says, quote, we have heard so much about the splendid situation in which we're approaching the Reichstag elections. And at the same time, we've been warned repeatedly against spoiling the situation by some impudent action. Previously, this was the struggle for universal suffrage in Prussia, and now it is agitation against the hubbub surrounding Morocco. The best way of throwing away the advantage of the situation would to begin to consider all party life and all tasks of the class struggle simply from the perspective of the ballot box. Taking a strong position against German imperialism could have helped educate the public on these issues and demonstrate a resolve of a revolutionary anti-imperialist socialist party. But the SPD was already caught up focusing on what would make them more likely to achieve electoral wins. The fact that Germany would support imperial military efforts for job security was not lost on the SPD. Analogously today, our politicians rarely condemn imperialist military actions on the campaign trail, and they tend to prioritize a national job perspective rather than an internationalist economic perspective. Party leaders in the SPD avoided talking about these issues, saying that they were foreign affairs, while the party needed to stay focused on domestic issues. However, Luxembourg points out the myopia of this. She writes, quote, the duty of social democracy is not to reassure public opinion, but to do the very reverse. It's to rouse it and warn it against the dangers lying dormant. We can only count on the resistance of the enlightened masses. They say that we should restrict our agitation exclusively to matters of domestic policy, to questions of taxation, social legislation, but financial policy and the stagnation of social reform are organically bound up with militarism, naval policy, colonial policy, and personal rule and its foreign policy. Any artificial separation of these spheres can only present an incomplete and one-sided picture of the state of our public affairs, unquote. Here we see Luxembourg highlighting the necessity of enlightened mass support, meaning that the masses must be politically educated for self-determination, as it is they who should be the motor of party decisions. A major part of the progressive value of an organized socialist party is that it operates as an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist educational organ. It shows that the ultimate success of the party lies in the resistance of the masses and not in attempting to co-opt bourgeois electoral power, because Luxembourg was clear that there was an organic unity of financial policy, colonial policy, militarism, and capitalism. The idea that socialism can be voted in without radically altering the ways in which we think about social and economic justice is not only incorrect, but it works to further obfuscate the real issues. In her Introduction to Political Economy, which she wrote for the SPD party school, Luxemburg aimed to make political economy comprehensible for the average person, cutting through the jargon and exposing the mystifications of economics made by academics and politicians of her time. For her, a basic understanding of political economy can and should be known by everyone. This is important for the very reason that we all contribute to and are controlled by economic forces, including our need to find some type of work and a source of income. Luxemburg honed in on the lie of politicians and academics who talked about the national economy as if modern countries had closed and self-perpetuating economies not closely bound to the workings of other places. What she writes about Germany in 1909 is probably even more true today. Nearly all the products we buy and use are made and resourced in places other than the country we live. Quoting Luxemburg, quote, "To make our life and work possible, we have almost all other countries, peoples, and parts of the world working for us. We work in turn for all of these countries," unquote. While exchange of goods is probably as old as humanity, the exchange of goods globally on the scale that it exists today is clearly a much more recent phenomena. The first thing Luxemburg will point out is that these new relations of dependency between countries are highly asymmetrical. They were forged by colonial dynamics of conquest, empire building, and economic expansion, resulting in extreme disparities of capital accumulation in colonial metropoles at the expense of their colonies. At the time of Luxemburg's writing, Great Britain received from its largest colony, India, 100 million marks, and in exports, another 12 million marks worth of goods. Luxemburg writes, quote, "The surplus is nothing more than the economic expression of the colonial exploitation of India by British capitalism. While the British tried to hide behind the ideal of aid and loans for alleviating poverty and improving their infrastructure, Luxemburg is quick to point out the hypocrisy of offering so-called aid that is primarily used to make India's exploitation easier for Britain, rather than to better the lives of Indians. Given the structure of colonial capitalist relations, there can be no such thing as humanitarian aid. These goods or finances, quote, are not sent for exchange, but for the production of profit. What we find primarily exchanged is not even concrete goods, but capital, which doesn't serve to fill certain gaps in other countries' national economies, but quite the reverse. It opens up gaps, rifts, and splits, and acts like gunpowder to transform these national economies sooner or later into heaps of rubble. Loans from colonial metropoles doubly exploit current or formerly colonized territories by monopolizing trade and collecting interest on debt repayments. And the irony is that these funds used as loans are manifestations of capital first accumulated by the expropriation of the very countries that they are being given to at a higher cost. For a contemporary example of this imperialist capitalist hypocrisy, we can turn to the history of France, the US, and the current conditions in Haiti. As W.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James have aptly argued, the Haitian Revolution not only sought to end colonial rule and slavery in Haiti, but also set off a chain of events leading ultimately to the end of the transatlantic slave trade globally. The Haitian Revolution was a landmark moment in the attempt to concretely develop our modern ideals of freedom and democracy promised but not achieved in the previous English, French, and American revolutions. While I won't go into all the details of why the Haitian Revolution wasn't able to maintain everything it promised, we cannot overlook the fact that the greatest obstacle to achieving democratic freedom has remained in the economic exploitation by neocolonial powers through its debts. The revolution would end in 1804 in Haiti, but by 1825, France would send warships and surround the island, demanding reverse slave reparations for all the revenue that French slave owners had lost post-revolution, which amounted to 150 million francs. On threat of military invasion and another war, Haiti was forced to agree to these reparations, and the US stepped in to make sure that Haiti paid back these debts, or the new republic would not be granted sovereignty or international respect by the rest of Europe. With military threat of destruction by Anglo-European capitalist former slave countries, Haiti, after 122 years, would finally finish repaying its debt to French slaveholders in 1947. However, as probably many of us have experienced with student loans, Haiti would pay back much more than 150 million francs in interest and debt servicing fees. France and the Citibank of New York, or as we now know it, Citibank, who eventually bought Haiti's debt from France, would collect the equivalent of $21 billion from Haiti just for dismantling its slave economy. Regardless of what liberal philanthropists say about their charity, whatever resources colonial nations offer to former colonies are only given for their further exploitation. We could extend this analysis to the role of the Clinton Foundation in Haiti, which collected over $13.3 billion after the 2010 earthquake, only to have a minuscule amount, 0.06%, go to local organizations. The main project of the foundation has been the construction of a garment factory called the Caracol Industrial Park, which was subsidized with the US and the Haitian government to build a $3 million factory complex in 2012. Over 1,000 Haitians lost their land to build the factory that would produce clothing for Old Navy, Walmart, and Target. The Clintons claimed that they would create 100,000 jobs, but only 8,000 ever materialized, and these jobs are extremely low-waged at $5 a day, far below the amount needed to basically survive in Haiti, which requires at least $10 to $20 a day. So in conclusion, Luxembourg's method of analyzing international economic relations, cutting through the misinformation of liberal and conservative politicians and economists, is still very relevant for understanding the developments of our time. Her holistic understanding of organization, struggle, and radical self-determination through revolutionary political education enabled her to challenge the imperialistic tendencies of her contemporaries. Taken to its most radical conclusion, her work points towards a globally oriented democratic society organized from below against capitalist imperialism. Luxembourg would eventually break with the SPD to form an organization that tried to better connect with these principles, first as the Spartacus League and then eventually the Communist Party of Germany. Luxembourg's murder would be organized by the very forces she was fighting within the SPD around issues of imperialism. We would not be wrong to draw connections to the ways that socialism was being constructed and popularized at that time and its later transition to National Socialism. The German Revolution, which brought to a head all the contradictions of Luxembourg's work, life, and death, resulted in the Weimar Republic that attempted to integrate socialist demands within a bourgeois liberal capitalist framework. But even the most progressive aspects of the Weimar Republic would last only 14 years before a fascist coup. While I'll not try to reduce the very complex historical phenomena that led to the mainstreaming of fascism in Germany, I will say that the way we frame and argue for socialist demands is incredibly important to the way that they'll get taken up by those in power. Either we construct socialist politics as fundamentally internationalist and anti-imperialist, or we narrowly focus on domestic issues and the immediate interests of certain US citizens and the interests of our nation at the expense of others. I hope that we follow in the footsteps of Luxembourg by taking always an internationalist position against imperialism, that we're not confused by the words of those who only want to preserve and augment US hegemony in the name of the US working class. I will close with the words of Luxembourg. She writes, "One cannot gauge phenomena such as modern imperialism with law and morality. The inseparable connection of imperialism with capitalist development is what we must teach the working class to understand. And consequently, the working class must draw the conclusion that imperialism, war, plundering countries, haggling over peoples, breaking the law, and the policy of violence can only be fought against by fighting capitalism, by setting social revolution against global genocide, looking within imperialist policies for remedies and solutions to its conflicts, wanting to oppose its Sturm und Drang by trying to scale things back to past conditions is not proletarian but petty bourgeois, a hopeless policy that boils down to a constant defense of the imperialism of yesterday against the imperialism of today." Thank you.
So we have a good amount of time for discussion, and I think what I recommend is so that we can make sure that questions that people want to ask, topics that they'd like the speakers to take up, or contributions that people may want to make to our themes of Rosa Luxemburg for the 21st century, so that everyone can hear. I'm going to ask Caitlin if she can help get the handheld microphone into people's hands, and then if our speakers can pass around and use the lapel mic there, or you can come up here, but I'm figuring you probably don't want to pop up and back down. Okay, great, terrific. So with that, so we'll start here. You just wait for the mic. Or
Thank
don't
you.
have to, but just like this.
My questions are twofold. They're related, but I'd like you to break them up, if you could, into the two. One is Rosa Luxemburg's position on state capitalism and how that relates to the Soviet Union. And also, connected with that is my understanding is that Luxembourg was opposed to the timing of the Berlin Revolt, that she actually opposed the insurrection at the time. And that was a tactical question, by the way, not strategic. Thank you.
Do you want to take a few questions? Okay, so we'll take a few questions and then give the panelists a little bit of a break. So back here.
I think this gentleman had raised his hand first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters. It's remarkable to consider how right Rosa Luxemburg was about so many issues and how relevant she is to our situation today. But no one, of course, could possibly be right about absolutely everything. And obviously, Rosa Luxemburg was wrong about some things, and she encountered certain dilemmas, and we can learn from her, not only in terms of where she was right, but also where she was wrong and the kinds of dilemmas she faced. And I'm curious what your take is regarding organizational issues. For example, Rosa Luxemburg realized early on the Social Democratic Party was on a dangerous course of accommodation to the ruling class. And she also realized leaving the party would have deprived her of a mass audience and contact with the infrastructure and the working class, etc., etc. So creating a new party would have led to sectarianism. At the same time, could she have done more than she did in terms of perhaps organizing a current within the Social Democratic Party? Of course, she very rightly so criticized Bernstein, she criticized Kautsky's position, she criticized the social imperialism and all of that as an individual. And the Spartacus League was sort of a loosely associated group, but could more have been done in terms of giving it cohesion and organizational focus in terms of a left wing within the party? And that is, of course, relevant today, where we have, a growing DSA and perhaps, the need to give more focus to left-wing, explicitly Marxist forces within DSA. Thanks.
So let's go ahead and get one more question. Before we take it back.
Thanks for all three presentations. I thought they were brilliant. I have a question for each of you, but if you want to respond to them collectively, that's fine. Helen, first for you. The old debates around the German SPD have become alive again. If you read Jacobin, there's an active debate about Kautsky that's going on. And that's very important for the shaping of a new socialist movement in the United States. Because as we know, in the SPD, there was a left, there was a center, and the right. Bernstein on the right, Kautsky in the center, and Luxemburg representing the revolutionary wing of it. What was the relationship between Luxemburg and Kautsky in particular? It's straightforward with Bernstein, but what's that Kautsky-Luxemburg relationship? Nancy, for you, I was really struck by how you put the question but didn't answer it, of the national question and the women's question right up against one another. Why does Luxembourg get the women's question so right in the way you laid out about how you have demands that are particular to oppression that are part of a broader class struggle? And in my opinion, she gets the national question really wrong. And it's a strained, it's provocative when you put the two next to each other. So what in her Marxism gets her right on one and wrong on the other, in my opinion? And finally, Alyssa, thank you so much for what you laid out about the necessary anti-imperialism of the new socialist movement. And what I have as a question for you, because we have imperialism in a new context, where if you think about Luxembourg and Liebknecht, one of the big things they put forward was the slogan during World War I, the main enemy is at home, but some people have drawn the conclusion that the main enemy at home is the only enemy we should oppose and not take up the position of opposing other imperialisms, which Luxembourg and Liebknecht did in a principled fashion, but many on the left fall down on that. So if you look at debates around Syria, Nicaragua, Venezuela, there's a kind of sympathy with autocratic regimes in the developing world and an identification with other rival lesser imperialisms to the United States that support those regimes. How do you think Liebknecht and Luxembourg would come in on that question?
So we'll give the panelists a chance to respond to some of those big questions.
I'll take a stab at some of them. They're sort of really related. I mean, I think Jerry's question about state capitalism is impossible to answer in a way because she was dead before the kind of concept was developed. But I think what we can say with some confidence is that she, as the revolutionary wing of the socialist movement, would have been opposed to the Stalinization of the revolution and the development of a new oppressive system. I mean, I think we can say with some confidence, I mean, she probably would have been killed by Stalin if she hadn't been killed by Noske, the Noske Guard. But the question is related to Axel's point about the twin dangers, which remain twin dangers for anybody engaged in socialism today, and that is, on the one hand, losing touch with the mass movement, and becoming an isolated sect. Or on the other hand, diluting socialist politics so broadly that you fall into mainstream ideas, like you don't address questions which are controversial, in the way that Alyssa was laying out. Could she have done more in terms of organizing a revolutionary current within the SPD? It's a very big burden to put on one individual. Nobody else in the world social movement realized how profoundly damaged the SPD was. It still was the biggest organization in the world, and it's where people thought that they were making the most difference. However, she realized the dangers earlier than many other people and literally wrote the book on it. Kautsky, she was very close with Kautsky for much of the life of the SPD, but she saw the dangers and articulated the dangers in a way that he never did. I mean, he remained pretty much a gradualist. He was more afraid of the dangers of opposing the party and taking on any of those controversial issues. But when she broke with Kautsky, she did so very decisively, because if you look at what happened, the logic of reformism was counter-revolution. I mean, Kautsky represented the wing of the party that killed Luxembourg and ended up opposing the revolution. So that's why I'm surprised and also somewhat concerned about the new attempts to rehabilitate Kautsky, because it seems to have forgotten some of those lessons. I better stop there because I'll go on too long otherwise.
Okay, can you hear me? These are all terrific questions. And I don't know that I can say much because they're dilemmas that that I feel and many in the room feel. Just on about how Luxembourg and Liebknecht would respond to left support for autocrats just because they're into U.S. imperialism and maybe related to the state capitalist question. I mean, I think she was such a principled person. She was so committed to socialism from below. I think she would have had disgust and total impatience with that simplistic, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend or something like that. So I think that is clear. What to do about all these people, I don't know about, but anyway. Now, organizationally, that is a dilemma that you raised over there. And I don't think it's easy to come up with an answer in general. I think everything depends on timing and a very, you know, careful assessment of the nature of the party you're dealing with. I mean, the SPD was very big and very powerful. The DSA is, you know, small potatoes by that comparison. But in both cases, you know, the question is, what is the room within the larger, not quite revolutionary group for the revolutionary point of view? If you have the freedom to organize and can influence some people, you know, that's important. And also not to be sectarian. I'm thinking more now about DSA, not the SPD. I mean, what the SPD did that was wrong had huge consequences. Okay? If the DSA takes a position that is, you know, not revolutionary enough from my point of view, okay, maybe they'll learn, you know. They're new, they're trying things out, etc. I wouldn't want to write them off for that reason whatsoever. People have to learn from experience. So, and what's the option? What are the options outside? You know, at some point she thought there were options outside, but anyway, some of us in this room have tried the options outside, and they're not so great. The question of comparing her position about women's liberation or sexism and capitalism to nationalism liberation, I don't know. That's a really interesting question. To me, her position about the relationship between sexism and capitalism, the similarities, I quoted Bebel, in the commonality in needs, in interests between women of all classes, and yet the distinct interests of working class women, which have to be prioritized. I don't know, to me that seems so obvious. It's so obvious. I mean, why is it so hard to see that? The national liberation question, I think I know less about, but it's vastly more complicated. It's not clear to me where, you know, the commonality and difference of interests, and I mean, it's more a matter of principle. But I mean, Lenin's position about progressive nationalism and unprogressive nationalism, and the position of from the imperial power versus from below. I mean, I think I don't know enough to answer that intelligently. So I'll pass it to you. Great.
I love talking about that. Okay. Okay, so the organizational issues about should she have stayed with the SPD, try to push on the left. I hate what if questions because in some sense, who cares? Because it didn't happen. But I sort of wish that she had taken a more principled position with the parties in Poland. And the issue is the Comintern, only one party was allowed to represent each country, and she basically was like, I have the right party, the SDKPIL, yes. And she was like, mine's the best. Actually, she didn't have mass support, but she basically just, you know, excoriated the PPS, which actually had mass support, and at least in the beginning was not narrow nationalist, even if it later would become that. And I actually think, well, what if she'd actually been organizing with the people in Poland, her knowing the conditions there, against the Germanization, all these other reactionary forces in the SPD, to build the the PPS is a revolutionary party. If I was going to pick a party, I would have picked them for her to be the left wing of. And so it's going back to the women's question, the national question. So on the one hand, I would just point out there's a really good book on Rosa Luxemburg by Raya Donievskaya. And her argument is that Luxemburg, it's tragic because she really studied colonization. She really studied in ways that I don't think Lenin did and anyone else did at that moment, the beginning of colonization, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all these empires, all the different things. She was reading Henry Louis Morgan and all these other people Marx was reading. But unfortunately, she didn't see the colonized as a revolutionary subject because I think she really thought it was going to happen in Germany. Like, she really was like, this is the party, the SPD is going to bring it. That's why she devoted her life to the SPD and so on. So I think that the tragedy, she just didn't see in colonization the creation of a revolutionary subject that would form these revolutions. And my hope is if she's principled, had she not been murdered, she would have changed her position. It's my hope. On the question of non-US imperialism, I think Luxemburg easily would be principled on that. She would say all loans are exploitation. So I don't care if you're China giving loans, I don't care if the US, whoever you are, loans are exploitation. I mean, if we're gonna say reparations or something, that's not loans, right? So I think that that's easy.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Peggy, right here.
Well, I don't know if it's exactly a question, and it's not all about Rosa Luxemburg, but what I am noticing is in what's going on right now, to bring it to the present day, the only person who is speaking out about imperialism and imperialism wars that's running for president is Tulsi Gabbard, and she is getting trashed everywhere every time she speaks. So it's clearly the least popular thing to do is to speak about that. I mean, everyone else is doing the one for, some not really socialism, but some less and more or less socialism, social democracy, and so on and so forth. But Tulsi Gabbard is the only one imposing imperialism, and she is being trashed on every venue.
Talking here, as we are here in the United States of amnesia, we've seen a pattern of, over the last many decades, of picking out the enemy of the moment, demonizing the leaders, whoever they may be, for whatever they might be doing, and then a huge international press campaign of basic propaganda campaign to smooth the way for intervention by either the United States or its proxies, such as the Contras. We have an example right now of a country that is probably has one of the most conscious and well-organized working classes and proletariats in the world, which is Venezuela, subject to that kind of a bombardment and misinformation campaign. And I would certainly wonder I don't really wonder, I wonder in more detail what Rosa Luxemburg would say of that. And before I turn over the microphone, I just want to mention that I'm hoping and planning actually to go later in this month on the 25th for a 10-day visit to a sort of a delegation to Venezuela. And I've been there a number of times, so I know pretty much what I'm going to see, but I'm going there to look at present conditions, and at this point there is room for a number of other people to join us, and I would like to extend an invitation. Come and see me after the talk if you're interested in finding out more about what's happening. Thank you.
And in the back.
So we do have someone local who's running for president, Bernie Sanders, and there should be a contrast. As long as Tulsi Gabbard was mentioned, I think maybe we could include what Bernie and Rosa Luxemburg may have in common, and what divergence you see in their socialisms.
All right. Okay, so I do want to make sure that we have time for the speakers to take up these questions or situations for thinking about Rosa Luxemburg today, but end close to 4 o'clock, as I know that Alyssa has to get to the airport. So with that, we'll take just one more question right there next to Frank, right here. Then with apologies for everyone else, but there should be a chance to also talk with the speakers afterwards.
Yeah. So something that I always find very moving about Rosa Luxemburg is, her principled internationalism and stance against war. But she experienced how easy it is for everybody of every class to get swept up into nationalism and war fever. And I wondered if she had, since you guys know her writing so well, any reflections on counteracting that, like why people are swept up in war fever and how that can be counteracted.
So I'll throw this back to our panelists now.
That would be me. Sure. I mean, I suppose on Bernie, what he shares with Luxemburg is, a tremendous faith in common people and the potential of labor and the centrality of labor, and he has a kind of popular appeal, which also Luxemburg had, a commitment to the movement. But I have to say that he really doesn't take on imperialism, and he has a tendency to pander to nationalism with a certain amount of China bashing and a certain amount. I mean, I think some of the reformist tendency to shy away from really what's the word? Dangerous, controversial issues. You can see them too. I think that for the thing to take away for all of these questions, going back to the question of the Berlin Revolt, which was raised earlier that didn't get addressed, the fact that Luxembourg was actually opposed to the revolt in January, but went along with it because the group that she was in was young and inexperienced and voted for it. I mean, there is a lesson there about the need for organization. We were talking before about the twin perils of becoming disconnected from popular movements versus diluting the politics. The reality is that without some kind of organized political force, revolutionary principle, based on revolutionary principle, then politics do get diluted. And there's a tendency to be, to go in the direction of nationalism, to steer away from the controversial issues. On the other hand, the thing that we can learn from Rosa Luxemburg more than anything else is the absolute necessity to stay in the realm of struggle, to always be in the movements, to always be in the street. The danger comes when you're secluded in a political office and you're no longer in touch with the needs, desires, aspirations of ordinary people, of all ordinary people. So it's not an answer to many of the questions that have been raised, but I think that would be the one lesson to take away, is the importance of always linking the political theory to the movements in the street. Your turn.
I don't think I have anything great to contribute on these particular questions. I mean, I'll leave it to the local Vermont person commenting on Bernie. Obviously, he's not a revolutionary socialist, and she was. I mean, he's not a Marxist. Anyway, in the United States context, he's made the idea of democratic socialism real, that we can say, hey, but it's not good enough, but it's good in this way, or, so that's important. I can't remember. Sorry. I'll pass it on to you because I think the questions relate to you more.
Yeah, okay, so there's Venezuela was one of the questions. So what nationalism? So I think Luxembourg would definitely, not support the U.S. Definitely, absolutely, hands off Venezuela. I think she would definitely support that. Would she think it's an extension of the Chavez Revolution? Hopefully, maybe. Yeah, I don't know if I know enough to be able to perfectly connect that. That's kind of too many what ifs for me. The Bernie Luxemburg, I think I totally agree. I think that what she was saying, this focus on domestic policy instead of foreign policy is like an issue. I think that those quotes that I read about like, well, let's get, nationalize the healthcare and all that stuff. Okay, good, but well, where is all of our money coming from, and what is this whole solution? Why is the military the biggest employer? What is that going to mean? What would it mean to, dismantle the military? So I think that those aren't questions that Bernie is thinking about, worrying about. Why? Because he's trying to become the president. Right. So he's literally going to be in charge of the military if he won. So, I mean, he can't really be saying these things or be thinking that way. That's not how you become the president. That's what I think. So I just think that it's apples and oranges kind of. I don't know. There's ways to connect them. The war fever, anti-imperialism. So I think that the important thing that Luxembourg realized from World War I was the reactionary character of the working class in European metropoles that had colonies. So if this is a war about imperialism, and the truth is your well-being is tied to the colonies that your country has, then yes, you have a big interest in maintaining that. So there's an interesting position which she didn't fully draw out, but what does that mean? That the working class in imperial countries, we actually do have a material interest in keeping US hegemony. It's good for us. And so it's really difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible to be internationalist or anti-colonial, but it's actually much more difficult to prove to people why we need to be, because there's actually not necessarily an immediate interest in the same way if you are from that place. Now it's different if you're Puerto Rican or something, or you have a direct tie to those colonial places being exploited. But if you're just the average Joe working class American, you actually have a lot to lose if the US falls economically. So I think it's difficult to be anti-imperialist.
I'd just like to add something. It's not exactly a response to the question, but I think it fits. When we use the word security in this country, especially after 9/11, we're always thinking about defending ourselves against intentional threats by people, by countries, etc. And there's this broader notion of security, which we have with Social Security and security blankets, needing, protecting our well-being in the broadest sense. And the military actually has talked about climate change as a security threat. But guess what they mean? That it's going to destabilize some countries, and then they'll come after us, and et cetera, et cetera. But Bernie Sanders said when he announced his presidency that the most important security threat facing us today is climate change, global warming. So if we take that notion of security and really use it in the broadest sense, and talk about, all the money that goes to the military and the lack of money that goes to fighting climate change, to taking care of our health and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a way to build, and given positions Sanders has taken, we could push him, to take seriously things that he has said.
All right, while we're doing this, because I just had to come back briefly to Alyssa's point, because, of course, in the end, Luxembourg very firmly believed that, in reality, the interests of the working class in Germany were the same as the working class and the poor and the peasantry in, you know, whether it's Morocco or other parts of the world. So, and in fact, if you take all of those, I mean, all of those war profits, you know, and all of the benefits of imperialism go to the ruling class of the imperial countries. They don't get distributed broadly. And so, and that's still the case today. There's a tremendous
situation here. It might be distributed broadly. See what I'm saying? Like, that's not the necessary, like,
well, there would be a massive redistribution of wealth and then there wouldn't be all of that money going into the war coffers and the military machine. So, but I think that the main point is that her vision of internationalism was that's how she cut against the tendency to nationalism. She always said, we share interests with the workers across the world, not with our own bosses. And that's, that's again still the case today. That's the kind of argument that we need to be making, and that it does have the possibility to become something that is mass, not a minority position. So, internationalism.
All right, so the discussion and debates can continue informally, but let's have one last round of applause for our panelists.